the man who touched the ark and dropped dead instantly, according to the Bible. The music was playing. The crowd was celebrating. Israel was finally bringing the Ark of the Covenant home. It was a day of joy, a parade of worshipers, instruments echoing through the hills, and King David himself dancing before the Lord. Everything seemed right. Everything felt holy. And then, in an instant, everything stopped. A man named Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the ark. The oxen had stumbled. The cart had shaken, and Uzzah, likely acting out of reflex, did what anyone might do. He touched the ark to keep it from falling. And he dropped dead on the spot. No warning, no second chance. Just the sound of celebration crashing into silence. It's one of the most disturbing moments in all of Scripture. Why would God strike someone down for trying to protect something sacred? Why would a moment filled with joy and worship turn instantly into one of fear and mourning? The death of Uzzah forces us to wrestle with something we often try to soften: the holiness of God. This story, tucked away into Samuel 6, isn't just about a man who made a mistake. It's about a God who refuses to be treated casually, a God who cannot be managed, boxed, or balanced on human terms. And it's about us, because somewhere in our desire for intimacy with God, we've sometimes forgotten His majesty. We've lost sight of what it means to approach the holy. As a story shakes us for a reason. It's meant to. It interrupts our assumptions about what is acceptable, what is forgivable, what is holy. And in that interruption, it opens the door for something greater: a deeper reverence, a more authentic worship, and a renewed understanding of the presence of God. So let's go back to that road, back to the cart, back to the moment when heaven touched earth and a man fell to the ground. Because in that moment, God wasn't just making a point. He was revealing something eternal, something we still need to see today. The scene unfolds with celebration. The Ark of God, that sacred chest which once dwelled in the tabernacle, is finally on its way back to Jerusalem. After years of being tucked away, neglected, and even captured by Israel's enemies, it was coming home. David and 30,000 chosen men are leading the procession. Musicians are playing. Joy is overflowing. And in the middle of it all is Uzzah. He is not some stranger. He's one of the sons of Abinadab, the family that had housed the ark for years. The ark had sat in their home, likely respected, but perhaps gradually treated as familiar. That's the subtle danger of proximity without reverence. When something holy becomes a backdrop to your routine, you risk forgetting its weight. The ark was placed on a new cart, pulled by oxen. That might sound noble at first, but it wasn't what God commanded. According to the law, the ark was never meant to be carried on a cart. It was designed to be carried by priests using poles. No human hand was to touch it. That detail mattered. It was not just about logistics, it was about obedience. God had already spoken, but somewhere along the way, Israel took a shortcut. Maybe it seemed more efficient. Maybe they were mimicking how the Philistines returned it on a cart years earlier. Whatever the reason, it was the wrong way. And when the oxen stumbled and the ark began to tilt, Uzzah instinctively reached out to steady it. And he died, right there, beside the cart, in the midst of the celebration. The music stopped. The dancers froze. The joy turned to terror. It's easy to read this and feel that God was harsh, even unfair. After all, wasn't Uzzah trying to help? Wasn't he preventing the ark from falling to the ground? But Uzzah's mistake wasn't just about action, it was about assumption. He assumed that his hand was cleaner than the dirt. But the ground has never rebelled against God. Man has. In that moment, Uzzah's good intention collided with God's unshakable holiness. We live in a world where intention is often treated as everything. If your heart is in the right place, we say, then surely it counts. But Scripture reminds us intention does not replace instruction. Good motives don't nullify divine commands. Reverence is not optional. Uzzah's story is not here to scare us away from God. It's here to awaken us to the weight of His glory and to remind us that His presence is not something we casually handle, not even when we mean well. To understand why Uzzah's action mattered so much, we need to understand what the Ark of the Covenant truly was. This was no ordinary box, crafted from acacia wood and overlaid with pure gold. The Ark was the most sacred object in all of Israel's worship. On top of it sat the mercy seat. flanked by golden cherubim with wings outstretched where the very presence of God was said to dwell. Not symbolically, not metaphorically. Literally, it was the throne of God on earth. Inside the ark were the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, Aaron's rod that budded, and a jar of manna. These weren't just historical artifacts. They were reminders of God's covenant, His authority, His provision. Every part of the ark whispered holiness. Every inch was sacred. When the ark led Israel into battle, they won. When it rested in the tabernacle, God's glory filled the tent. When it was mishandled, as in the Philistine temple of Dagon, chaos followed. And when the high priest entered the Holy of Holies once a year on the Day of Atonement, he approached the ark with trembling and blood because God's holiness was no joke. And that holiness extended to how the ark was moved. In Exodus 25 and Numbers 4, God gave explicit instructions. The ark was to be covered, never touched, and carried on poles by the sons of Kohath, Levites trained and purified for the task. This wasn't tradition, it was law. Law given by the one whose presence rested on that ark. So when Uzzah touched the ark, it wasn't just a physical act, it was a breach of boundary, a crossing of the line between man and God. It was the same instinct that once led Adam and Eve to reach for what was not theirs to touch. The holiness of God is not like human goodness. It's other, blazing, pure, consuming, and the ark carried that holiness with it. We struggle with this because we like a God who is approachable, and He is through grace, through Christ, but He is never casual. The ark teaches us that God is near, yes, but also utterly unlike us. He is not common. He is not to be tamed. And when we treat Him as ordinary, we step into dangerous territory. The ark wasn't dangerous because God is cruel. It was dangerous because God is holy. And in His mercy, He told His people exactly how to approach Him. We just forgot to listen. David had been dancing. Moments before Uzzah's death, he was overwhelmed with joy, leaping, praising, rejoicing before the Lord as the ark moved toward its new home. He was a man after God's heart, eager to restore worship, eager to see the ark return to the center of Israel's life. But now he stood frozen. The man who had just been singing is now silent. Scripture says David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah. But it also says he was afraid. The celebration turned into confusion, then into deep reverence. David didn't move the ark any further that day. He left it at the house of Obed-Edom, a man whose name is barely known, but whose obedience would soon overflow with blessing. David returned to Jerusalem. Stunned by the moment, he had to wrestle with a truth that many leaders, even today, would rather ignore. God's presence cannot be manipulated. It must be honored. The beauty of David's story is not that he got it right the first time. It's that he responded with humility. He didn't abandon the ark. He studied the law. He came back to God's instruction. And when he brought the ark home the second time, it was different. This time, it wasn't carried on a cart. It was carried by consecrated men. Every 6 steps, they stopped to sacrifice. The movement of the ark became worship in motion, slow, sacred, reverent, and David danced again. But this time, his dancing came from a place not just of joy, but of deep understanding. His worship was not just emotional, it was aligned with the fear of the Lord. Not fear as in terror, but as in holy awe, a trembling love, a joyful reverence. David learned that God's presence is not a prop for human celebration. It's a consuming fire. And to host that fire, your house must be prepared. That moment reshaped David's leadership. It reminded him and us that reverence is not in conflict with celebration. In fact, the deepest joy is born from holy fear. The more we understand who God is, the more freely we can worship Him. Because true worship doesn't begin in the hands, it begins in the heart that knows who it's worshiping. There's a quiet danger that creeps into our faith, not loud and rebellious, but subtle and comfortable. It begins with familiarity. We start to speak about God casually, approach Him lightly, handle the things of God with more convenience. Then conviction. Slowly, reverence gives way to routine, and the sacred becomes common. And that's when we forget who He is. Uzzah's story is hard to read because it confronts this tendency head-on. It tells us that good intentions can still be irreverent, that nearness to God's presence doesn't grant permission to treat it carelessly, that there are boundaries not to keep us out, but to keep us safe. We don't like boundaries, especially spiritual ones. In a culture that celebrates accessibility, even in our theology, the idea that there are holy limits feels offensive. We talk about God as friend, and He is. We speak of Him as Father, and He is. But we cannot forget He is also King, Creator, consuming fire. He is not common. When we treat the sacred with casualness, we risk creating a version of faith that's comfortable but powerless, a version of God who fits into our schedules, agrees with our opinions, and never challenges our comfort zones. That kind of God isn't holy. He's tame. And a tame God cannot transform a wild, broken world. The holiness of God isn't about scaring us. It's about reminding us that there is more majesty, more mystery, more meaning. It's about lifting our eyes from the ground to something higher. The fear of the Lord isn't the fear of punishment, it's the awe that comes when you realize you're standing on sacred ground. When we forget that, we lose something essential. We lose the weight of worship, we lose the wonder, and we lose the clarity that holiness brings. Uzzah's death wasn't just a warning to him, it was a warning to the entire nation, and to us, that the presence of God is not to be managed, it's to be honored, revered, feared, loved, because without holiness, there is no glory, and without reverence, there is no revival. The ark didn't stay in the house of Obed-Edom forever. Something extraordinary happened while it rested there. For 3 months, Obed-Edom's household was blessed. Scripture doesn't give us the details, but we know the fruit of God's presence. When we see it, peace, provision, protection, joy. News of the blessing reached David's ears, and this time, he responded differently. He realized the issue wasn't the ark, it was the approach. So David gathered the people again, but now with a deeper understanding. The ark was carried the right way, sacrifices were offered, reverence was restored, and something beautiful happened. Joy returned. Not the shallow excitement of a parade, but the rich, reverent joy that flows from doing things God's way. This is what redemption looks like. God didn't end the story with Uzzah's death. He used it to awaken a people to His holiness, and then, through obedience, led them into joy. The fear of the Lord did not close the door to intimacy. It opened it wider. It purified their worship. It brought the presence of God back to the center of their lives. And that's the thread that runs from Uzzah to us. Yes, we must fear the Lord, but not with dread, with delight, with awe, with surrender. That kind of fear doesn't push us away, it draws us near. And through Christ, we can now approach the throne of grace with confidence, but never casually, never arrogantly. Jesus didn't die to make God less holy. He died to make us holy enough to stand in His presence. He is the greater ark, the perfect mediator, the one who was touched by death so that we could be touched by life. And now, because of Him, we can carry the presence of God not on carts or with trembling hands, but within our hearts. The glory that once rested behind a veil now lives inside of us. But it still comes with reverence, still demands surrender, still calls for clean hands and pure hearts, because He is still holy and still worthy. God doesn't need us to steady Him. That's the sobering truth of Uzzah's story. In trying to help God, Uzzah crossed a line that wasn't his to cross, not because God is harsh, but because He is holy. And holiness isn't something we manage, it's something we submit to. In a world that tries to shape God in its image, Uzzah's story reminds us that we are the ones who must be shaped, that we are not the handlers of God, we are the carriers of His presence. And we carry Him best when our lives are aligned with His will, when our hearts are surrendered to His ways, and when our worship is anchored in both love and fear. The death of Uzzah wasn't a random act. It was a call to remember that God's presence is powerful, that His instructions matter, that His holiness is not just an Old Testament footnote, it is the foundation of every revival, every moment of true worship, every life transformed. Maybe today, you've been trying to carry the things of God in a cart of convenience. Maybe you've lost the awe, the reverence, the weight of what it means to walk with Him. Uzzah's story is not meant to crush you, it's meant to call you back, to remind you that God is still holy, still good, and still unwilling to be handled on human terms. But here's the good news. The same God who struck Uzzah is the same God who blessed Obed-Edom. The difference? Reverence, obedience, alignment. So take off your sandals. Let your heart be clean. Approach the presence not with presumption, but with awe, because the God who won't be handled is also the God who wants to be known. And those who know him rightly will never treat him lightly.